Hello and welcome to Votewatch24, week 5 of this general election campaign. Always something to talk about, and I am joined by our editor of Byline Times, Hardeep Matharu, and our chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer. So what we're going to look at today is Nigel Farage is no joke. As you will have seen, Channel 4 did an undercover report into one of his activists and discovered, maybe not to everyone's surprise, disgusting examples of racism, authoritarianism, homophobia. Our editor, Hardeep, has written a very poignant piece today, which you didn't want to have to write, did you, Hardeep? Just explain to people what you wrote about and why some people think is a joke, but for other people, this comes with great fear and loathing.
Yes, I didn't want to write it because you get a lot of abuse when you write these things about how you're an immigrant and a foreigner and all this sort of thing.
Your parents were immigrants. You're born here.
Yeah, I was born here, but to certain people, I'm an immigrant still. Anyway, so I didn't really want to write it. I was a bit reluctant to, but I did feel I had to. And I tell you why, because so as you said, Peter, there's a Channel 4 news investigation that came out last night, and it was an undercover reporter who was following some activists for Reform UK, the leader of which is Nigel Farage. And what emerged were comments that were homophobic, so calling a pride flag degenerate. There were comments about people coming across the channel should be shot. And just to warn everyone, I am going to use the term because I do think the Prime Minister is right on this. There were comments about Rishi Sunak being a fucking packy. And as these came out last night, I was reading a BBC News article about it in which they had asked Nigel Farage to respond. And I'm just going to read this because I think it is really important to give viewers context to show that I'm not selecting a quote, but it's the context. So he was asked about this, and he said that the party is not perfect, and that and Reform itself, the party, said that if they were unacceptable comments, and these activists would no longer have anything to do with the party. But this is what Farage said. This is the full quote, according to the BBC News. We had one or two candidates that have said things that they shouldn't have said. In most cases, they're just speaking like ordinary folk. They're not part of the mainstream political Oxbridge speak. We understand that. In some cases, one or two people let us down and we let them go. So when I was reading this BBC News article last night, the thing that really struck me was this sentence in particular. In most cases, they are just speaking like ordinary folk. And I thought to myself, why would Farage, in the middle of being asked about this, put that line in? Because this is, to be clear, this is not to do with political Oxbridge speak. No. This is a dog whistle that suggests these people are just saying what everyone else thinks.
And unfortunately let it out. Unfortunately, they let it slip. That's the implication.
Well, that's the implication. That, Farage's sort of public image is in great part about, well, I say what you guys really think. Yeah. I say it like it is. I'm the common man. And so what he was implying, to my view, my reading of it, was these are just normal people's views. It's how people speak. These people happen to be caught on camera doing it. And and reading it, though, viscerally, it's terrifying. And my family are Asian and we're immigrants. And I just feel the fact that anyone who's saying these sort of things or suggesting these sorts of things or implicitly condoning these things, having any prominent position in British politics is really, really worrying on a level that is visceral. It's not just a theoretical thing. And I did feel today that in all of the coverage of Nigel Farage over the years, Channel 4 did a great job. They did the job that they're meant to do as the fourth estate. But we all know here at Byline Times that too much over recent years, the established press hasn't held him to account as a serious political figure who has had influence, whether it's through political decisions like Brexit or contributing to the wider political social climate we're all in. And
can I just point out,
because of that, it can be so easily missed that he is just this entertaining figure who makes good copy, gives colorful quotes, is always a bit of a joker in the pack. But no, because there are people who read this stuff and are impacted by it and are scared by it. And so Farage is no joke is our front page today on our website, Peter, because it's time for the media to learn its lessons and hold him to account for the serious political figure he is. This guy is not a marginal character, and we need to be aware of this, because whatever happens next Thursday, I do think the Farageist politics is here to stay, and it is going to become more Trumpian like the Republicans in America.
That awful word, pejorative, I won't repeat. Obviously, your parents would have heard it. You probably heard it said to your parents. I've heard it said to friends of mine, parents. Steve Edgington, a reporter, I think, for GB News, says, you can hear that in any pub around the world, in the country, right? That's what Nigel Farage is saying too. Most ordinary folk, this is normalization. Think like that. I've been in a lot of pubs. I've been in a lot of trains. I've been in a lot of public places. I'll ask Josiah in a moment. I have not heard that term for 30, 40 years, except for one occasion on a train filled with EDL supporters. But they're telling us that everybody thinks. Have you heard that term?
Yeah, extremely rarely, and obviously, I'm not from an ethnic minority background, but I'm slightly darker skinned than a lot of white people. I did get called it once when I was growing up in Manchester, but it is exactly as you say. It's this normalization of hate. They want it to be seen that these kind of slurs are common and normal, and in defending their party, they are throwing everyone else under the bus to do so by saying that, the language of ordinary people, the language of, let's face it, by saying ordinary folk, he really means white people, doesn't he? That is how people talk. That is how people talk, and
or think as their doctors, their colleagues who happen to be a bit darker than everybody else are. Some other that deserves abasement and abuse.
Yeah, and I think we are at a point now, although with less than a week to go before the general election, where, as Hardeep suggests, Reform are receiving some of the scrutiny they should have received a long time ago, and in particular Nigel Farage, who, whenever you've seen him interviewed before, it's always in a place where he's been able to have a pint in his hand, where he's been able to have pub goers or whatever around him, and just to sort of laugh off any criticism. We are at a point now, I think, and I hope, where Reform are receiving at least a fraction of the scrutiny that they need, because there's this strange dichotomy where Reform have received far more press coverage than almost any other smaller party, and yet the key questions about what kind of party they really are, the kind of ideology they have just been completely ignored and replaced with this banter between journalists and what is actually potentially quite a dangerous pretty much far-right party, certainly hard-right party. And it's interesting that the media here are, whenever we talk about, the European elections, they talk about far-right parties, the concerning rise of the far-right in the other week's European elections. And yet Reform share many of those policies,
and the platform with his being to the FD, he knows Geert Wilders, he knows Le Pen. It's not like there haven't been 10 years in the European Parliament of forming those alliances.
And they're never called far right, and their activists are never called far right. And what we saw yesterday in that Channel 4 show was that it is a port. It's a sort of welcoming home for people who do share very disturbing ideologies, I think.
So Hardeep, there is an allegation flying around now. It was an actor. There's no proof of that, but it's pushed by Richard Tice, the party, his partner, Isabel Oakeshott, and Farage itself. This, by the way, another friend of Nigel Farage is Alex Jones of InfoWars, who famously called a mass shooting of young children crisis actors. But even if this is true, which it isn't, Farage himself, we've spoken about his Russian connections. He has 2 or 3 times said Jews run the media. He's said many Islamophobic statements, has made comments about Romanians want to live next door to them. How on earth has he been on? Has he got this semi-permanent chair on Question Time 34 times in the last 7 or 8 years? Is this one of the huge kind of oversights of the British media, even bigger than sort of Boris Johnson?
I think it's getting to that level. And today, I think there is a new development which concerns me more, because I think this is the new era that we're going to see in the right of politics now in the years ahead. So the suggestion has been made from people connected to reform that the activist who was making the comments about Rishi Sunak is an actor. Apparently,
and therefore planted by Channel 4.
A plant by Channel 4, and sort of this is a setup. And I've seen various statements. One says that he admits to being sort of a part-time actor, but he also admits that he was campaigning for reform. So both things could be true. Channel 4 has put out statements saying it's absolutely not the case, that this is a setup or an actor was hired or this is any kind of gotcha moment. And, you know, Channel 4 News, their investigations team are acclaimed, you know. So, but the fact that this is emerging and the fact that in this afternoon, Nigel Farage was on Loose Women, which is not a current affairs show, but very mainstream for many households in the country. And he was there being asked about some of these comments. And again, it's the suggestions. So he started to say, well, there are claims that this guy's an actor. And so the ladies asked him, are you saying this is a setup? And he said, well, I don't know, but I'm saying something doesn't fit. Something's not right. Yeah. And these are sort of very Trumpian tactics. Completely. Because you're just sowing a seed of doubt.
Against the media particularly.
Against the media, Channel 4, and everyone watching that. Some people will think, well, maybe we don't know exactly if this man's an actor or the details of it, but yeah, maybe there's something in it. And this is now a new. Yeah. Up until now, I don't think we've seen that level of mainstream conspiracy theory or this notion of the media is out to get us. We have seen that with Trump in America, but this is kind of, I would say, a step in that direction now. Direction. He's also had a platform on Loose Women to say these things. That's the main thing. He's been given a platform to air these views. And so I think actually the last few days have been very telling, as Josiah says, on two counts. One, you see the power of the media, the established press, when they hold this party and those politics to account, although I still don't think there's enough excavation of why the party attracts a fair number of people who hold these more extreme sentiments. Why? Dig down why. But one, you can hold people to account. And two, that is going to be more relevant than ever because Farage is a politician and his kind of conception of what tactics he's going to use next are very much there. And so it's really concerning, yeah.
It may be worth pointing out that when he was challenged in Clacton about, one of the first about the racist comments himself, yes, but have you not heard the anti-white racism, right? So this is very much a US meme, they're racist, the left are racist against whites. Also, just on this QAnon element, QAnon, which is a famous American conspiracy theory which backs Trump, has all sorts. There are a lot of COVID conspirators, this heart group attracted around reform. Some of their candidates, I've been seeing information, people all part of the coronavirus was a scam, that it was genetically engineered by the World Economic Forum, all that. It attracts all the people. So those conspiracy theories are built in. But Josiah, I mean, we've got more to come out this weekend. It's not like even this guy had been an actor who'd somehow bamboozled Channel 4, because Channel 4 would no way under Ofcom ever hire. It would just be the biggest scandal. That's how the right wing might work, but never here. But there are so many others, aren't there?
This is it. I think, even at face value, if you look at Channel 4's programme last night, Andrew Parker wasn't the only person to make hideous comments. A member of Farage's inner circle made comments, as you say, about, the pride flag being degenerate. He also basically called gay people paedophiles in that same comment. Now, as far as I know, he's got no acting. And there were other canvassers as well, I think who were included that. So this isn't just one rogue rogue actor or lone wolf within the party. There are other examples even within that one show. But yeah, Byline Times has done a lot of digging over the past few months into, I mean, to be honest, you basically pick a list of half a dozen reform candidates. And within that, you will have, after about an hour of digging, about 10 scandals and 20 inquiries about potential.
So somebody said to the team, it'd be a scoop if we found a non-racist reform candidate. We'd report that as an exclusive. We're only joking.
It is somewhat like shooting fish in the barrel. But, the fact that it has been quite easy for us to unearth pretty disturbing examples of, racist posts being shared by reform candidates, conspiracy theories, about the World Economic Forum, or the Great Replacement theory, that white people are being deliberately replaced by immigrants as part of some government scheme. These have all been shared by reform candidates in recent months. I think it's well over a dozen now who've been dropped.
And many haven't, because he said, haven't been dropped because it's too late, isn't it?
Exactly. We're after deadlines have closed for nominations, so they can't change the names on those ballot papers. And it seems like they've basically just given up on suspending candidates when they've been found with, with racist views and so on. It has been a real running theme. But it's also made me think, if other outlets had just taken, a bit of time to dig into some of these people, like we have over the past few months, then it would be quite a different general election story.
And the only sort of explanation for this from reform has been our vetting processes have not done the job that we would have hoped. I think the company that we were using, or the organization we were using, has sort of let us down. It's not got the sufficient levels of experience. And that is the explanation that has been given for this. And I do think, again, when it comes to the likes of the BBC and Channel 4, very established media organizations with huge amounts of resources, they should be asking these questions. It's not enough to accept, well, there was a vetting process.
And he's suing the vetting people.
It's a bit of a coincidence.
Yeah. And it's very cheap. Yeah, it's a very, it just gives data, it doesn't. We could go back to the media, but what about the role of other politicians? I mean, I saw Peter Oborne, who's our diarist, is coming to the festival. We're going to talk about what's happened to conservatism at the festival. This time next week, still some tickets left. It'll be amazing. We'll have live election coverage. And what he said was, he looks back at Heath, Edward Heath. You have the Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell, clearly racist, and he throws him out of the party. What, even from Starmer, and we'll talk about Clacton in a moment, nobody's come out and said, they're so scared of losing that base, I think, from the Conservative Party. Today, personal attack, yes, but all the other attacks, they have never really stood up against Farage, have they?
The Conservative Party?
Yeah.
Well, this is the issue, I think. And I just want to quickly talk about Rishi Sunak's response, because I think this is really important. So he gave an interview today on camera in which he was asked about these comments, calling him, a Paki. And he was visibly, you could see, more so than he ever normally is, because it was quite a contrast. You could see it was difficult for him to talk about. He said he's very angry and very upset by these comments, especially that his young daughters would have to know that people in reform are calling their father this. And he said he used the term fully without abbreviating it because he felt that the importance of the issue required that. And he seemed quite moved and emotional saying it. And I watched that and thought, this is a very sad moment, because he could have used his time as Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of colour in this country, to call out many other issues around race and representation. And having a person who is a minority in that position, who's able to have the platform to say to the entire country, this is why this thing matters, and this is important, and this is not acceptable in the kind of country we are, to have that position and not use it more.
Other instances in the past.
It is very sad because, and it's not because Rishi Sunak is a brown man and therefore he should have certain views and therefore he can't be a right-wing politician or a conservative politician or a Brexiteer. He can be all of those things. He doesn't have to be someone who has a certain identity just because he's a man of color. But the fact is he is a minority. And today, in that clip, it's quite clear that he knows exactly what it's like to be a minority and to be called these things. He knows what racism is, actually. He's aware of it. And to be aware of it and therefore not use that platform, the integrity of that platform and what it requires to call out other instances where this has happened is, I think, it will be something that is one of the real shortcomings of his tenure in office. So when Lee Anderson, his deputy, said that Sadiq Khan, the Labour London mayor, had handed the city to Islamists, effectively saying, you know, Sadiq Khan is an Islamist, an extremist, a terrorist sympathizer.
Because of his belief, his faith.
Yeah, because he's a Muslim.
Muslim mayor,
Sunak did not say that was Islamophobic. He said it was wrong, but he did not say that was Islamophobic. We've had a lot of instances, I think, in these culture wars where the black community, for instance, have raised issues off the back of the Black Lives Matter movement about racial justice, racial inequality, systemic structural inequalities, and the legacy of colonialism. And Sunak's predecessors, people like Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, condemned some of those people.
But also condemned taking the knee.
Condemned the Black Lives Matters movement. Sunak could have used his time in office, not to say I agree with everything these people are saying, but I know what racism is. Because if he can call out being called a Paki, why can't he see that other people of colour who have had different experiences than him, that don't have the privilege he has attained in life, they will have had experiences that are different, but he will know that's because they're a minority. And so it's really sad because ultimately, by not calling out enough or at all this sort of Faragist dog whistle politics, Sunak has unfortunately helped normalize a political environment in which Farage can say, they're just talking like ordinary folk. And this is what's really difficult to unpick. The media doesn't really want to excavate all of the nuances, and indeed, it won't have the time or the priorities to do that. But this is what we're talking about, and so there's something. And Sunak today was condemning Nigel Farage's sort of endorsements or favourable comments about Andrew Tate. He was condemning that.
Finally.
And it's too late. It's less than a week to go.
Just one before I talk to Josiah on this is that, way back in 2010, do you remember that famous tape when Gordon Brown was caught by Sky and met this woman who said about Polish people, right? And there are all these foreigners here. And he called her a bigoted woman. It's forced into apology. And the whole sort of media really attacked him for that. So it is bigoted to say other people are bigoted, basically. If you make a comment, other people excluding other people, you're the bigot. It's this whole kind of weird mental state that Brexit and a lot of these things got us into, was that don't offend the white working people if they have bigotry. Don't be... And I was thinking of that moment on BBC, the most extraordinary moment. Do you remember we cut away from Farage early on in the campaign, or maybe just before the campaign, BBC presenter, BBC News. And he had made extreme about Muslims. There's always going on about, immigrants and Muslims, which is provocative language, inflammatory language. She was forced to apologize. What on earth is going on with our media if they have to apologize for calling quite clearly a hard right with far-right elements, a party like Farage, with his whole history of far-right statements, going back to his youth, true, in his adult time, that we have to apologize over that. That as a media just seems like ridiculous. And she was a woman of color as well. The humiliation that you have to apologize to Farage, who's saying these things. Forget what his activists are saying. I just find that extraordinary. Josiah, so on that sort of Vote Watch beat, you've been digging around. We've obviously got more stories coming about reform. And I think that wider point, Hardeep, we'll be exploring, won't we, at the festival and the next edition. Has he ushered the doors of this populism? Has the horse bolted? We'll see We will see, because we'll see how well they do. For all the attention they're getting, Reform, it's like 5 times as much as the Green, twice as much as the Lib Dems. They're still staggering at 15, 60%. They'll be lucky to get 6 seats. Oh, yeah, so just on that, on the seats, Clacton, right? So Clacton, Farage is likely to win there, as we must admit. So for the first time, on the 8th time, for all these BBC chairs, for all the attention, RT used to film him every time the Occasional Times turned up the European Parliament, he'll become Member of Parliament, having boosted for 15, 20 years by the media. But they're not going to have that much political power. And it looks like, what this tells about, like France with Le Pen, or the FDs in the 20s and 30s in the eastern part of Germany, that there really aren't that many people who use this language who think these thoughts.
No, I think it's going to be an interesting one if Farage is the only one elected for Reform UK. I mean, we do have this first past the post voting system where he will be seen, I think, as the sole representative of all of the people who voted for Reform. So I think we can definitely expect his profile to rise even further. I mean, if he doesn't win the seat and Reform still get, a large number of votes, then there will also be that element of sort of martyrdom, that these people are locked out of politics. And that, again, is a risk of first past the post voting. You end up with potentially hundreds of thousands of people feeling, like they're completely locked out of Parliament. So it's almost a lose-lose situation at this point.
And he could also claim that Trumpist thing they often do. The vote was stolen here, in a way, not necessarily, though they are suggesting postal votes, all kinds of things are going wrong. Here is the system's repressed us.
Indeed, and I thought it was really interesting, perhaps darkly amusing, when the Reform UK manifesto came out, because they were calling for a ban on postal voting, which obviously has been seen as being vulnerable to takeover by ethnic minority people before, but the ban wouldn't apply to elderly voters. They'd be protected. So in other words, voters who are more likely to opt for Reform. But yeah, those younger people from ethnic minority communities are much riskier. Keep them out. And I think we are going to see more of this. I mean, we have seen, and as Votewatch has been covering, efforts at voter suppression, questioning, whether our electoral system is secure. The voter ID was introduced on that basis. This is the first general election where we're seeing voter ID imposed for all voters. Could we see large numbers of people turned away, or perhaps just not bothering to turn up on the day? These are big questions which, we will need to be keeping an eye on. I think maybe Byline will be one of the few who's actually watching that. But do watch this.
So just specifically on Clacton, do you want to say something?
I was just saying, I think this point about that you make, Josiah, about if Farage wins the Clacton seat, he will be taken to be the representative of all the members of the electorate who voted for Reform. I think that's really important, and I think actually his prominence, it will increase. I mean, in a way, he was so associated with the Brexit project. We've had the referendum. Apparently, Brexit was done. Certainly, no one wants to talk about it.
Not even Reform
Not
UK.
even Reform. And yet here he'll be able to say, look at me, I'm back. And this is years after Brexit. I think he will feel within himself there is some new mandate that he has to offer the people who have voted for Reform. And I also think it's about, us always coming back to how power works in this country, because he has never been elected to the House of Commons, and he has had a lot of influence on the right of British politics. So not just through the referendum, but also the whole culture of the Conservative Party and how it shifted.
We only had the referendum because of UKIP and its growth, which he did.
And it'd be very hard to see how the Conservatives have gone down this path if characters like Farage didn't exist. And so he's always had considerable influence, because it's not so much about just having a seat in Parliament. It's always been behind the scenes, how he's influencing them. And so if finally he does have a seat, I think he really will be. I've got a mandate. I've been elected all these years later to now fulfill a mission for the people who are voiceless. And so I think it's going to be even more important. I think that it's going to be more relevant, Reform and holding it to account. And it's a very important point, Josiah,
and also looking at what the next project is for Farage, because obviously, he doesn't want to talk about Brexit. He's barely mentioning it in his speeches, despite, admitting that it has been a failure. That it's not working. But next, I think is net zero is policies to to tackle climate change. Reform UK is coming for those policies next. It's done Brexit.
What about Stop the Boats, though? Long before the Stop the Boats was adopted by Priti Patel and then Braverman, Farage was spending the summers after Brexit in a boat in the Channel. Oh, look at these people. And the BBC followed him. And Sky had their boats out there. They made this huge thing. Population that couldn't fit into Wembley Stadium was going to somehow besiege us all. So they don't think he'll go for that? It's got to be net zero next, or because the other thing is the Stop the Boats. That becomes let's get out of we're out of Europe. Let's get out of the European Court of Human Rights. That's the kind of next anti-European project. But you think net zero could be and it's also talked about he shouldn't have the second lockdown as well. So he's also picking up some of this COVID conspiracy stuff.
It's picking up these wedge issues. Yeah, I think there will probably be three priorities for reform. Whether they're in Parliament or not. One is definitely sort of opposing net zero policies. The other, is immigration, particularly if, the Conservative Party adopts a more moderate centrist stance. Reform will see themselves as the sort of, the bastions of anti-immigration policy and rhetoric. And then, human rights. I think they will use immigration as a stick to beat, our membership of the European Convention of Human Rights with.
We should be a little bit optimistic about this because they will have absolutely, as they've never really had. I mean, when Farage was in the EU, Parliament in Strasbourg, he was always going on about fishing. Talk to Richard Corbett or another MEP he never turned up to the sessions or debates about fishing. I mean, he does nothing except appear on TV and scheme and have strange ways of raising money. We have that PayPal thing, it's a private company reform. So this is not. Is it actually going to affect our governance in any way? It'll affect the media. Hopefully the media will learn. I mean, George Galloway is a similar left-wing position, though, about whether he's actually left. He gets into Parliament. Nobody wants to talk to him anymore. Could this actually be the end of that kind of... Because he'll either take over the Tory party or be completely marginalised by them. And he could just become this exploded balloon in tweed with a pint in his hand.
It could, but I think, again, your point about the media is important, Peter. And this thing about, you bring up the example of when he was going out to the coast watching for people coming across the channel. And the BBC and prominent broadcasters were following him and writing news reports about it. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that, they were doing that when he wasn't an MP. So now he'll be an MP. Yeah. It's not beyond the realms of possibility at all that there'll be, as Josiah said, a list of priorities. There'll be a number of stunts and sort of ways that Farage wants to start rabble-rousing around them. And the BBC, ITV, the prominent newspapers, now when he'll actually be an elected MP, there'll be even more perceived legitimacy to follow him around. And I think, again, it's that issue of, will that exert influence on a Labour government with a considerable majority? Well, it may not, but will it if it's plastered on front pages and that is seen as significant to Starmer? Starmer might take a different stance towards the media, but we don't know. But
the interesting thing, he's been used as a kind of outrider, especially the right-wing press and elements of the BBC, I would say, where they're trying to be representative, but trying to represent that constituency. To kind of push the Conservative Party further to the right, But look how the Mail treated him over the Russia stuff, over his support for Putin, Does he have? He can't. He's now, he's pushed the Conservative Party over the cliff. So there will be some. Anyway, this will be very interesting times.
Very interesting, but like you say, Peter, the constituency of people who want to vote for reform and Farage, and I think we do have to be careful that yes, a number of prospective candidates for reform have stood down because of sort of quite hard right, extreme racist sentiments. But we have to be very careful that not everyone who's going to vote for reform by any means it will endorse those kind of beliefs. And there is something to be said, and I think it's easy to forget all of this, that there is a constituency out there to which his message does resonate, who still feel powerless, who even after Brexit feel all the reasons they voted for Brexit nothing's changed, it's just gotten worse. And so, again, thinking about the last 14 years and all the way from austerity to things like Brexit, the cost of living crisis, these really kind of structural issues which are still there. How often do we ever talk about, levelling up, which was all about those deindustrialized towns in England having a rough deal for many years. So that constituency, which switched to Johnson for levelling up and get Brexit done, it still exists and it's switching to Farage. But the media, the risk is that the media goes along with Farage as a character and his talking points, which garner a lot of headlines, but actually he's not looking at the underlying issues. Why are people voting for him? What are the issues they actually care about? That's the difference here, and we're not looking at that at all.
So on that level, I'd really recommend everybody to read Chris Gray's blog, right? Came out today, and he has got obviously writes similar stuff for us on Byline Times. He's saying we're looking at the epiphenomenon, like these things happening. He says nobody looks at the structure. Exactly your point, as we're always talking about. And he said that's what Brexit did. It introduced populism into the mainstream. A huge decision was taken on a simple director mandate, and it's roiling underneath the politics ever since. And that's an international thing. We're seeing it in France with the old what they used to call Front National rising up, and the question is over just getting back to Labour is how it's likely to form majority, and so actually be in power. But if it doesn't deliver to the left behind, and let's be clear, I think most reform voters I had enough of this. Tories and Labour are just the same. We disagree with that. They're different. Politics doesn't work, full of corrupt people. It's just the rich doing it. Well, I point out that the reform is funded by millionaires and billionaires. I'm not going to solve it. But yeah, this anti-establishment feeling could be captured by them. So, Josiah, maybe you can illuminate us. Why has Labour sort of given Farage a free ride? There are reports that I forget the candidate, very attractive, very stylish young Labour candidate who's getting a lot of social media. Opposed, they've withdrawn access to canvassing, withdrawn support for big Labour push in Clacton, and Labour are second in place. Is that just strategic? They're not going to win, put the money elsewhere. Or are they somehow playing a rather dangerous game? Oh no, Farage is good for us because he undermines the Conservatives.
Yeah, that's right. There are reports that that Labour sort of asking its candidate in Clacton to travel about 180 miles away to campaign in a more prominent seat. I mean, it does come back to this issue of how Labour are running this campaign, really. It's a highly centralised campaign. I've heard reports of other candidates in winnable seats being sent hither and yon. I think they feel burnt by previous election campaigns where they've maybe felt more confident than actually was the electoral reality. But I think, in sending their candidate out of Clacton and not campaigning quite so hard there, I think they sort of turn their gaze away from what actually is a really pivotal election there. As we've been talking about before, if Nigel Farage does win, that could change the shape of the next parliament, could change the shape of the Conservative Party. Reform UK are essentially a pressure point, a pressure group on the Conservative Party. So, there is a lot at stake here. And I think, it does. There's a certain duty, as Neil Lawson writes for us, the director of Compass, today. There's a duty, I think, for Labour to take this really seriously.
What do you think, Hardeep?
It's really hard to understand because the candidate is still standing in that seat for Labour, Josiah. That's correct.
Yeah.
But they're not. They're being encouraged to leave the constituency.
So but I think it's the justification. I'm not justifying it at all.
It's not the best used resources.
Yeah, there are other seats that they're less behind, and if they pushed canvassers, got out the vote more, spent more money there and advertising there. I mean, it feels slightly suspicious to me, but we've had nobody inside from the very heavily centralised campaign team say this is all part of a strategy or anything like that. There's no explanation.
No, it is, and one candidate I was speaking to says that Labour have basically been turning off access to the canvassing software that candidates use if they don't sort of follow these demands to campaign in more marginal seats or seats that are seen as more winnable. So it definitely is something that's happening. Labour has become a much more centralised outfit. The candidate Jovan Owusu Nepal. I mean, I don't think he's commented particularly, obviously, his it's a very sensitive time in terms of the election. But you would imagine that candidates are getting pretty annoyed if in areas where they think are winnable seats being sent quite far away.
Well, I'm reminded when the BNP came in the East, you remember they had got various seats in Beckton and places like that in East London. Both Labour and Conservative under Margaret Hodge sort of worked together to get rid of the BNP. And it's kind of, we need something like that almost.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of this one Neil is writing about, it's sort of symbolic significance, if nothing else. If Labour has made the calculation that actually the reform vote will be significant there and Farage will win the seat, it still gives an odd impression on a symbolic level, I would say. I mean, maybe it's really is the case that this candidate from Clacton really is required in a more marginal constituency and really could make a difference in that constituency. But it gives an impression that Labour, not that... I don't think it really is sort of, we want Farage to get the seat to undermine the Conservatives. Conservatives have undermined themselves, quite frankly. But it is a sense symbolically that Labour, it should understand what you've said, Peter, is down the line, if a Labour government doesn't deliver, there's going to be a proportion of people who may be susceptible to voting for something like reform, even more to the right of reform.
Because they're not going to go back to Conservatives. It's so toxic for so long.
Yeah, and it's sort of having that foresight to appreciate that, to understand that. And from the beginning, from the get-go, saying, even if it's just in a symbolic way, we don't want to, from day one, risk any voters sort of being dissatisfied and going that way. Yeah. So just for that, I'm surprised the Labour Party hasn't put more of a showing in.
There's a danger. I completely agree. I think there's a danger in Labour's thinking, which is that reform are, essentially crushing the Conservative Party, and there's probably a tendency within Labour to sort of look at that and think, well, we'll just let them get on with it. But as you say, there's a real danger in that because eventually those chickens will come home to roost, and if these sort of seeds of distrust and potentially bubbling hate underneath the surface do rise up and they haven't been challenged by the Labour Party, then it poses a risk for a Labour government. It poses a risk for, I think, the state of our politics as a whole. It
poses a risk for the people because the people in this country, and it's not often people of colour, it can be doctors. I mean, it's a very Trumpian move, and the media are being accused of all kinds of crimes. People, gay people of being nonces, or that's these are not light threats. That kind of language doesn't lead to sort of polite debate on the floor of the House. It leads to violence. So just in all that context, maybe it's worth sort of ending up, because we're going to end a bit earlier today, and we're exhausted after these 5 weeks of campaigning. But let's go with two subjects. We'll end up on a big connection with Nigel Farage, which is Donald Trump. If everybody remembers, Nigel Farage wasn't going to stand in this election. He was going to go and campaign for Donald Trump. And we can talk about last night's performance, which Hardeep watched. I missed, but I caught up bits later, but Josiah's caught up a bit. But just before we get to pure Trumpism, can we talk about how well the Conservative campaign is going, which is not, as far as I've seen, it's pretty flatline. The only movement is a lot down for Conservative. This is in the last 5 weeks. Usually they say the polls narrow. They start off like that, but because the incumbent party has all this power and this money and people start scrutinizing, the polls narrow. They've remained exactly the same, 20-point lead in average, with a bit of Tories going down with a rise in Reform, a tiny 2-point drop from Labour. So we really haven't seen such a huge movement in the polls for obvious reasons, in that events have not worked out well for the Conservatives. But we have seen innovative new forms of lying, haven't we? We thought he'd had them all. We've had
exactly what we needed.
Yeah, exactly what we needed for our vote watch. We've had people pretending to be from other parties, using newsletters as their colours. We had in the mayoral campaign looked like a police warning, and the police warning was, that Sadiq Khan is going to take away all your cars, right? What's happened this week? What new forms of dissembling literature have we had coming through our letterboxes.
Well, yeah, no, it's an endless supply of content for Votewatch, which is good and bad at the same time, I think. But yeah, Adam Bienkov, our political editor, is covering this week some of the ads that the Conservatives have been pushing on social media. And I mean, it's just getting quite strange and desperate, I think. You know, they are saying things like Labour are going to introduce like paper mile charging, something that
Across the country.
across the whole country, something that they've was a target. That was one of the headlines that the Conservatives used against Sadiq Khan this May. And, that completely flopped. Sadiq Khan said it was completely true. He wasn't going to introduce paper mile charging. Yeah. The Conservatives have clearly thought, okay, well, that worked really well in London. Let's do that message.
Roll it out across the
rest
country.
of the country and see how it lands. So they are throwing a lot of stuff and kind of seeing what sticks. And yeah, it harks back to the May elections where the Conservatives were pushing out leaflets about Labour wanting to take away your cars. There were recent examples of the Conservatives posting what looked to be sort of fake letters from HMRC.
Yeah, this was the fake tax line. Have you seen these? It's that line that they were going to put up $2,000 on your taxes. It's been debunked. But they had a letter. It's on our social media somewhere. It looks like it's from HMRC. It's got all the styling and saying they were going to take $2,000 off your. And then what did they do during the last debate? What happened to the CCHQ account?
Yeah, so some of our listeners might remember in 2019, the Conservatives, during one of the TV debates, they renamed their Twitter profile to Fact Check UK. They've received a huge amount of criticism for that from fact-checking groups who actually were independent and fact-checking the claims that were being made during the debate. Of course, the Conservatives have, again, during the BBC debate earlier this week, they've basically done a very similar thing, which is they renamed their profile Tax Check UK. And it kind of seems like they are deliberately looking for,
gags almost.
Gags that they know will be shared and debunked, but that therefore that will get more reach, be seen by more people, even if that's just in sort of disproving what they're saying. They've kind of adopted a tactic of it just being basically as outlandish as they can and hoping that people will share it with rage. It's sort of like rage baiting. And they did a similar thing.
Martin Lewis, they had fake sort of cutting of Martin Lewis as if he's talking about Labour taxes, didn't they? The financial expert.
Exactly, yeah. Earlier this week, using a clip on social media of Martin Lewis talking, well, it seemed to be talking about Labour's tax plans, but then, and the Conservatives saying that, this respected financial expert, Martin Lewis, was basically saying that Labour were going to massively hike taxes on working people. He was talking about something completely different, and they just clipped that in what was basically quite a misleading way. There was another clip of Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, talking about Labour's plans to improve trade workers' rights, change laws around trade unions. And again, it was just quite bizarre. They basically put it in black and white. And as she was talking about Labour, for example, banning zero-hours contracts and changing some union laws, there was a French moustache that sort of slowly started rising and appearing on her face.
What was that about?
A French beret that appeared on top of her head, with this attack line being that Labour were going to introduce French-style trade union laws. And I actually had through my door today. It landed on in my inbox. The Conservatives saying that Labour were going to introduce French-style trade union laws, so we can see a taste.
French-style soup,
with
and wine.
Baguettes were coming to a workplace near you, quelle surprise. So we're sort of getting a sense of the Tories not really trying to win the election, but they're sort of trying to see what might work as a wedge, as a way of attacking Labour when they do get a large majority.
It reminds me very Cambridge Isaac Levido. It's very Cambridge. Two things about that, Hardeep. One is quite. Maybe two encouraging things. Tell me if I'm being naive and excessively optimistic. One, it doesn't seem to be working and affecting the polls. Two, and this is quite important, Labour don't seem to be emulating it. They aren't ramping up a whole series of counter lies. Not that I've seen. I'm sure they have. There's some dodgy things going on in local constituencies, and truth is a little bit twisted. They seem to have not responded by going to the same level.
Yeah, and I think there's some explanation of that from the prime ministerial debate that we saw this week on the BBC. And I was talking to my mum about it and asking her what she thought. And she said that, Rishi Sunak had much more, had a bit more energy. And I think that was fair. And she said that she would have liked to have seen Keir Starmer just respond a bit more and call a few things out and have some more answers readily at hand to some of the things that Rishi Sunak was aiming at him. And I talked to her and I was thinking about it. But a lot of, even in that debate, what Starmer was reiterating was, I want to return politics back to being about public service rather than personal or private interest or power. And I think his whole, because there were other members of the audience who also sort of questioned, does he have the personality on the world stage to represent Great Britain, was one of the questions. Rishi Sunak was also asked, the same thing. And with Starmer, there is a sense that he's very aware when lies are being lobbied his way and things are being taken out of context. And, Rishi Sunak is trying to rile him into saying something or go down an issue. But there is a sense that he just does not, the impression I get is he just does not want to engage in that sort of politics.
Do you think that's strategic? That's not just a personal preference. Sounds like this is now a strategic
Could be strategic as Josiah, as we're saying. But also I think it perhaps is his character. He does not want to get too dragged down into that. I suspect he wants to get into power and try to, as I've said before on the podcast, practically change people's lives in the hope that will avert the need for these sort of people who are dissatisfied and powerless to go to reform or go to more extreme sentiments in our politics. But this notion of who he is, and he believes it's about service, he doesn't want to get to... And it's a really interesting point, because on one level, there's a certain integrity that is represented, I think, for some people in that approach. But on the other hand, as my mum was saying, is there a danger that in not answering back enough, and unfortunately having to operate in the way the politics works, which is very combative, which is full of misleading statements from his opponent, in not answering back enough, is he perhaps giving an impression that he doesn't know what to say for some people?
This happened with the
2000
bit. So people said in that the 2000, and then people said he was interrupted, couldn't respond because of the moderator, but he didn't respond, knock it down then. But then they became on strong the next day. And I'm wondering, because we're in this political zone, we're wanting the fast chat. Your mum's watching it. She wants it. We all want a bit of that backwards and forwards and stopping lies that happen. But in the slower reality of how that didn't move the dial a bit, the 2000 tax. And maybe if the Conservative be better off for other factors, nothing's going to change it. I'm just wondering, in terms of the classic, because I think, not that I'm a Starmer supporter, I'm not a Labour supporter technically. I mean, we're here to add journalists and analyse. But one of the key things which defeated Boris Johnson was Starmer forensically getting on the record lying, like before, 6 months before it came out about Partygate, right? Are we looking at perhaps a longer strategy? It's like you don't need to, have you just got to hit that key thing?
Well, there's also, I think, the issue where, if Rishi Sunak comes out with 10 basic, you can call them lies at this point, because, they've been disproven, all these claims about, £2,000 Labour tax hike and so on. If Rishi Sunak keeps coming out with these during debates and Labour is responding to each and every one of them, then you're entirely fighting on the Conservative terrain, which is exactly what they want to do. Throw out outlandish stuff and hope that the story at the end of the day is, Labour, Keir Starmer denies
wrestling with a pig.
planning to impose £50,000 tax upon I don't know, single mothers or something like that. And they basically, they don't want the conversation to be all about Labour having to refute everything that Conservatives are saying, because that's completely away from where Labour want to be, which is on the front foot. And you've seen this a lot over the past 2 weeks, which is where, and it's played out actually on the front pages of the right-wing papers like the Mail and the Express, where the Conservatives will say something like, Labour haven't ruled out imposing like a feudal tax or something like that,
or killing the firstborn or something like that. I haven't ruled that out.
Labour haven't ruled out exactly, kidnapping your nan next Tuesday, and then there'll be a front page from the Daily Mail saying, shame as Starmer refuses to rule out kidnapping your nan, and then Labour eventually they have to say, no, we're not going to kidnap your nan actually. But then and it's sort of this quite hideous game that's being played out on the front pages, and I think part of the reasoning for Labour just not responding to those is that they don't want the next day's front page to be Labour denies planning to kidnap your nan, but it is because of the because of the state of the media. They sort of, I don't know, they end up being forced into a corner.
But I think this is important because I often say, don't I, that it's all about the water we swim in. And I've said in the past, just because there's Labour government doesn't mean overnight everything is going to change in terms of the political climate, how people interact, the talking points, the rhetoric, the narratives in our public discourse. So I think in a way, and we'll see if it succeeds, it may not, in a small way, I think Keir Starmer is trying to do his part to try and change that water a little bit by doing exactly what you're saying, Josiah, by not engaging on all these points and being driven down that path, which fundamentally isn't illuminating to the electorate. It's not. It doesn't really give you any information to go on either way. It's just a bit of a spat.
I was impressed by what he said about, I hate call it the trans issue, anyway, the kind of contentious issues that some people feel around trans people, and he sort of said, let's take the toxicity out of the debate, and that I made some people irate, but people people get irate if they don't get their own way in the process of peace or negotiation and compromise. But so hopefully, I mean, that's what we'll be looking at ahead, isn't it? Basically, is what happens to the right. Does Farageism, is populism here to stay? And also, how does the Labour government, because we don't have a presidential system, how does a Labour government go from keeping a tight ship, not making a mistake, let their enemies make the mistakes, to actually ruling the country, which I think you're right, Hardeep, requires them to come forward and make statements. This is unacceptable. Stop dividing people on the issues of sexuality or race or religion. These are, that sort of leadership we don't know. Looking briefly overseas, because we've only got another 5 minutes, and we're not quite seeing the current Democrat president transmitting the same kind of energy and confidence that you would have expected.
No. I woke up this morning, like everyone, and looked at the headlines, and I therefore then watched the debate myself because I wanted to see whether those were accurate. But these weren't just headlines in the UK media, obviously. There were many, many headlines in the American press, and the American press is different from the UK, as we've pointed out before. It is considered a bit more objective in terms of, it doesn't endorse ideology or anything like that. And many, many commentators, as well as newspapers and people who have been allies of the Democratic Party and President Joe Biden for a number of years were saying his performance was incredibly sad. It was very weak. He's not up to it, and he must stand aside. And having watched it, I was not expecting that to bear out, but watching it was uncomfortable because regardless of what is going on with Biden's health or otherwise, he just doesn't. It doesn't seem that he's in the position where he should be standing.
How does he's 83 now? When we were in New York, do you remember we went to New York, scoping out American edition, news on that soon, and we talked to cab drivers who, immigrants, people of color, whatever, Greek background, and a lot of them said, I just don't want to vote for Biden, he's too old.
Yeah, I mean, this was the problem with this presidential debate last night for him. It's not the case that he failed to land the punches. He quite obviously didn't seem well. His voice was very hoarse. He was very confused and muddled. He was taking a lot of time answering questions. There was no energy to it. I think it was, again, like a different level of anything anyone's ever seen in a presidential debate. And so there are many, many questions now, which have been denied by the Trump camp, around whether he should be the presidential candidate.
Do you mean the Biden camp, not the Trump camp?
The Biden camp. Yeah. Trump, to be honest, was Trump in that debate.
And
he was very much himself.
But less belligerent than he is. Now, there is, Americans started this idea of TV debates and presidents. And the famous one, whether it's true or not, but is Nixon against Kennedy in 1960. I wasn't quite born at this, about to be born. And he looked unshaven and sweaty, and he actually had this awful paste on, and he lost on looks. So there's this kind of, that idea. I know that he looked swarthy and suspicious compared with Kennedy looked clean cut. And, that's the problem of the debates we've now taken over. And then, of course, there is a history in America of changing, presidential nominees before the election, just before. Lyndon Johnson famously didn't go for a second term, and we had all the turmoil in 1968. So the good news is, Hardeep, even if things get quiet here, which they might not, we'll have a new Labour government, we'll have Farage taking over the right, and, Starmer hopefully doing something. We'll still have America to write about.
Yeah, indeed. And it's easy to forget, and I was reflecting on this in the past weeks. It's so easy to forget that Kamala Harris is the vice president, because for the 4 years that we've had the Biden administration, she's sort of been hidden. And Bonnie Greer, who's our columnist for our print edition, she is American but lived in the UK since 1986, and she has observed that she feels that there is a lot of sentiment around the sort of quite radical right MAGA movement, that actually Biden's not up to it. And if he gets elected again, he'll serve 1 year and hand it over to Kamala Harris for reasons not only of practicality, but also of symbolism and, representation and the importance of those things. And that is what the MAGA movement and the extreme elements of it really, really fear, to have not only a woman president, but a woman president of color. So I think Bonnie is right that it's more complicated, because ordinarily you'd look to the vice presidential candidate, wouldn't you, and say, well, they should just step up. And they've had 4 years in office, they know how it works. But here, I think the added complication is she's a woman, and she's a woman of color. And there is going to be a sense that, she's already been quite hidden for 4 years. Would the Democratic Party, for all of its, progress on these issues, put her forward as the candidate? And indeed, that's not really the conversation. The conversation isn't Kamala Harris is going to step in. It's there needs to be someone new, which kind of says it all, I think. I'm no expert on America, but
who are some of the names? Yeah,
Newcomb, Buttigieg. There's people you wouldn't know who are kind of clean-cut white guys, yes, who would go down well. Well, we wait and see. The good news is that...
What do you think, Peter? What's your response? Are you rattled by it? I often find
I'm very rattled by it, but I do think, I'm so glad it's happened now, right? This is very early debate. They don't usually happen till the late summer. After the nomination, then there's 2 months before anybody, almost 2 months before the nominations take place. So, he's not the official, neither Trump nor Biden are officially the candidate. That only happens in the summer. Peter Oborne reassured me this probably better this happened now, but who knows? It's such a wild roller coaster. And the best place to find out a bit more? Byline Festival next Saturday and Sunday and Friday, actually. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Because we'll have Peter Oborne there. We'll have Alex Hall who's an American-based British diplomat. We'll have Bonnie Greer. We'll also have Jay Rosen, Professor Jay Rosen, expert on American journalism. We'll have our journalists, Heidi Kuda, Matt Bernardini. So we've got 2 panels, haven't we, on American politics and more besides. And for a very special treat, if you can't make it, there's also a wonderful Bad Press Awards with Rosie Holt and Jonathan Pye, which I've just finished the script on. All kinds of other wonderful things. There's bands in the evenings. There's comedy. I'm asking Josiah to bring his guitar, but hopefully there'll be karaoke in a lovely environment in the Devon countryside with great weather forecast. There's a few tickets left. And if you can't join us, I know it's a long way for a lot of people. And it's not, it's not that expensive, but it's not cheap a weekend away. We will be doing a live broadcast on election night. We'll have the whole team there, these people we mentioned. We'll have Sankita Miskar with us. We'll have Adrian Goldberg. We'll have, I think, Peter Oborne there, but we'll definitely have Nafees. We'll have all kinds of people. Otto English will be there. So next Thursday, only 6 days away. Well, you can see we're all tired. They're all looking very excited. Look at Josiah. Hardeep.
It is
Frantic
exciting.
energy.
It is exciting. As a journalist covering election, isn't it, Josiah? It's so exciting. Like I said, I remember covering the 2007-15 election, and I was for Epsom when I was a local newspaper reporter, and I've been busy all night. I remember coming home. And I said to my dad, I think I want to get into politics. He was so buzzed up, and he went, "That game's not for you."
You're getting close, honey. So that was journalism. Another game entirely. So next Thursday night, we'll be going live from Dartington Hall at 9:30, all through the exit polls to about 10:30. We'll be coming back, I think, at midnight. Meanwhile, we'll have guests. We'll have a town hall, which we won't be filming. But for you, if you're watching on our live stream with amazing work that Sean does all by himself here, making this magic happen, we'll be broadcasting direct from Dartington.
And of course, with Adam Bienkov.
And of course, Adam will be there. Also, we'll be presenting the whole show. Adam, of course, will be there. How could he possibly
He's
not be?
our John Curtis, really, isn't he?
He's our John Curtis. Well, yes, John Curtis.
Much younger.
Yeah,
John
younger
Curtis.
John Curtis, and also a reporter rather than the pollster. He will be there, but we'll be broadcasting to you live at 9:30 till 10:30, 12 midnight to 1:30. We hope to have a few of those Portillo moments. You remember the famous moment where the would-be next leader of the Conservative Party lost his seat in 1997. We don't know if that will happen. We'll keep our eyes open for it. We'll also return in the morning with, hopefully, a full sense of what the new government is, what's happening with the king. Is somebody driving there in the car? Who's here up, who's down? That's 11 o'clock on the Friday morning till about 12. And then we're going to move to the live festival. So if you can't make it to Dartington and the lovely countryside of Devon, do catch us on TV. We'll be doing some filming and some reports you can catch up on there. But meanwhile, thanks for following us these 5 weeks. Thanks for keeping us standing. Adam is not here today, but thank you, Adam. Thank you, Josiah. Thank you, Hardeep. We're still standing, and we'll be there again next Thursday. See you then.